many of you know our speakers already, but I'm going to give them their official introductions, was educated at Rochester, Oxford, and Brown universities. And he's had fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, among other places. He is an expert in, if you didn't know this already, Judaism and the land of Israel during late antiquity, which is the rabbinic period, the Roman period, the early Byzantine period. He is a historian of religion, and he's one of the few scholars, because scholars, you know, we tend to have our specialties, he's one of the few people who ties together history and archaeology. He's best known for work on Targum, and those are translations of the Hebrew Bible. And those are translations into Aramaic, and they were read alongside the performance in Hebrew because the local audience didn't actually knew Aramaic. And he's the founding director of UW Religious Studies. These days he directs the American Heritage Center, and there he showcases our really quite remarkable archive. And if you're not yet aware of it, we just put up a poster for the Stan Lee Beyond the Book exhibit. It's a wonderful exhibit. It's on until October, and it will be, there's a sort of a related event. There's going to be a Stan Lee Con when the semester starts, so you should come to Stan Lee Con. Dr. Kate Hartmann, educated at the Universities of Virginia, Chicago, and Harvard, and she's an expert in Asian religions, particularly Buddhism. She, among her languages, Paul has Arabic, she has Tibetan, modern Tibetan, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Hindi. But I think she's also doing some others as well. Anyway, she spent a long time in various communities in Asia, including at the Buddhist nunnery in Ladakh, the Tibetan Library of Works and Archives at Dharamsala, Ranjung Yeshe Institute, I hope I'm not slaughtering these, in Kathmandu, and at Sichuan in Chengdu. And her work focuses on the history of Tibetan pilgrimage to holy mountains, right, which is something we feel strongly about here, right, mountains. And she is currently working on a book on that topic. She's also interested in Buddhist ethics, vision, visuality, theories of place, autobiography. And she's going to focus today on the challenges of identifying a new Dalai Lama. Paul is going to talk about the challenges of a space that is sacred to many people. So then Kate will talk about the Dalai Lama. And Professor Jean Garrison, who was educated at the University of Wyoming and the University of South Carolina, has held fellowships at the Kolleg Forschung Group at Freie University, with the Council on Foreign Relations, where she served in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and with the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation in Washington. Her research, I think you've come across it, focuses on American foreign policy, particularly US-China relations, energy security, and civic engagement. And that combination of interests and talents made her the founding director for the Center for Global Study, among other things. She's also the founder of the Malcolm Wallop Civic Engagement Program, and the leader of UW's successful campaign to be recognized as a Carnegie Engaged University. She's also the founder, with many of you, of the Centennial Speakers Program. So it is our absolute delight to bring you these three. They're going to present and then be in conversation with you all. So, and we're going to go in order of Paul, Kate, Jean.
Okay, thank you. Am I coming through the speakers?
Yes.
All right. Okay, let me start by setting the stage. A long time ago, a bunch of Canaanites founded a city that we now call Jerusalem. It wasn't very big. In fact, it was probably just a village. Its its strongest part is that it had some walls. At about 1000 BC, several centuries later, a fellow that we now call King David, or who styled himself as King David, decided he would attack it with a force that he had brought together. He actually managed to conquer it, take it over, and decided it would be the capital of his, what he would ultimately call his kingdom. That's it right there. The rest of that is just a mountain, very small village. His son, Solomon, who came into power about 30 years later, decided he would build a temple, and which he did. The red area is still the part that David conquered. And so what you can see is that Solomon added almost 2/3 of the size of the city as he built the temple up at the top of the hill. Fast forward 900 years, there's still a temple there. The Romans decide to take over Jerusalem, and under Pompey, they conquered in 63 BCE. And after a lot of problems caused by the destruction of the battle, they ultimately put a fellow by the name of Herod in charge, who ultimately becomes the person we know as King Herod the Great. And he, among other things, is a great builder. He is he's sort of a Rockefeller type. He's giving money everywhere, building everything, new cities, new palaces, new forts. He even gave a large benefaction to the Olympic Games of his day so that they could build some more stadiums. And he rebuilt Jerusalem, and he built a temple there. The temple was twice the size of any temple that had been there in the previous 900 years. Everything is going great, and then the Romans decide that the Jews aren't behaving well. They're actually doing rebellious things, causing problems, and the Romans decide to invade and put down the rebellion, and by 70 CE, AD, for those of you who don't speak the Common Era language, they destroy Jerusalem and its temple. In the short term, they banned Jews from living in Jerusalem. Within about 70 years after another war, they wind up banning Jews from living in Judea at all. And from that point on, until the modern era, there were very few Jews ever living in what we think of as Palestine, the land of Israel, whatever terms. There aren't any Jews there, or at least few who will admit to being there. And that's the start of what we think of the Jewish diaspora, which is not ended really until the start of the 20th century. So that's the background. Today's topic is we want to look at Jerusalem and think about how Jerusalem is shaped by its past context. And the first thing I want to observe is let's get all my buttons here. I want you to look at this wall right here, at the top of that wall. That's probably the hottest spot, if not in the world, then certainly in the Middle East. On one side is the wall with the patio that you see in front of it. That's the most holy site in Judaism. And on the other side of that wall is the third most sacred site in Islam. And they are separated by the top of that wall. And this makes it one of the biggest flashpoints. It's one of the few places in the Middle East that unite almost all Muslims as an important place. Should something happen, it could, shall we just say, set a match to the fire of the Middle East. Hugely symbolic in a religious sense, and of course in a political sense. One of the things that you discover if you've ever looked at recent history and thought about it, anytime a Muslim ruler gets into trouble, he raises the Palestinian cause, or the Israelis are controlling our holy site, and immediately it solves a very significant part of their problem. So, but I want to take a different approach to it, and I want to look at this as a local issue. The fact that we have two sacred spots right next to each other, what does that mean just in a local sense? How do people live with it? How do they manage it? How do they carry on with their lives? So, well, let's look at the top. This is the Dome of the Rock, the third most holy site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. And if you look at this piece of the platform of what's above the wall, you see the dome here, and then you see the mosque. This is Al-Aqsa Mosque there. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine. It's a place you take a pilgrimage to, you visit. Al-Aqsa Mosque is the place where you worship on a regular basis. In Islam, you get together and pray 5 times a day. That happens at the mosque, not at the shrine. On the other side of the wall is what we call the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, or in Hebrew, the Kotel. It's the western wall of the Temple Mount, not the temple itself. And in Judaism, it is the sacred site. People go there on sacred days, whether it's holy festivals or just the Sabbath, and they go and they worship there. In modern Jewish law, it is considered to be a synagogue, which means, and this is an Orthodox or even an ultra-Orthodox synagogue, so it really has to follow the expectations and rules of that kind of a synagogue. For example, there's strict separation of men and women. You can sort of see it there in that wall, and then that wall right there. Proper decorum on the Sabbath, nothing that smacks of work, which in one definition that is followed by the ultra-Orthodox is nothing electronic. Electricity happening is work. So you can't bring in your cell phone, you can't bring in your camera, etc., which is a hardship because this is actually a tourist spot. This huge patio in front of it is where all the tourists gather, and they want to get involved. This is cool. You know, this is where you can leave a prayer to God and roll it up in a little piece of paper, stick it in. But you can't walk in there with your camera, etc. You better be traveling with a group so you can leave it back and so on. Just a shot from the top. This is actually a platform. This is the platform that Herod built for the temple 2,000 years ago. And that platform is still there. When you look here down towards the bottom, you're still seeing the Herodian stones that were laid at his expense. And you can see how the Dome of the Rock is sitting on top, and then here's the western wall here with that big patio and so on. To step out a bit, the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall are in the old city of Jerusalem. It's a city surrounded by walls, as you can see in these different pictures. These walls were built by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. He's one of the longest ruling Middle Eastern potentates. He was in power for almost 50 years. That's a pretty long time given the life expectancies at the time. Those walls are still there, and they define the space of the old city. If you Google Jerusalem, and particularly if you look at the pictures of Jerusalem, you will find that you're looking at the pictures of the old city. This is a city of 1 million people. And most of them don't even live near the old city. But when you Google Jerusalem, this is what you find. It's stuff about the old city. The old city within the walls is divided into 4 quarters: a Muslim quarter, a Jewish quarter, a Christian quarter, and an Armenian quarter. And they are very segregated in those religions. They all have an extremely long history. They go back at least more than a millennia in most cases. They were there when the Crusaders were there a millennium ago. And if you look at that red line there, this red line, this is the green line. So let me explain something about the green line. In 1948, Israel fought a war of independence. The Palestinians who lived there called it the Nakba, which is essentially the catastrophe, the time that their society was destroyed by this war. The map on the left is essentially what became the State of Israel after the armistice in 1949. But the one in the middle is what was proposed as the partition of the country between the Jews and the Arabs in 1946, proposed to the United Nations, which had an active committee trying to resolve the problem of the two peoples here in this one space. And the pink area would have gone to the Arabs and the green area to the Jews. And all the little black spots are the settlements, the sort of farms, the kibbutzim, and so on that the Jews were building and where they lived. And what you notice in the third map is that's the armistice lines. And one of the things that you notice is that there's a few settlements that go up a valley right here to Jerusalem, and that's that weird bulge into what would have been the Arab space according to the UN partition. And that's the modern state of Israel. Just to see how this turns out in Jerusalem, the dotted red line is what is called the green line in modern parlance. That's the line between the West Bank and Israel, or in 1949, it would have been the Kingdom of Jordan and Israel. And what you notice is that the old city and the two sacred spots are on the Jordanian side of the line. So in 1950, so a year later, Jordan annexes both of these into its kingdom formally. They become Jordanian territory, which means the old city becomes part of Jordan. During the battles of 1948, the Jews tried to take the old city and defend it. They were unsuccessful. They left, evacuated certainly the Jewish quarter in the old city before the armistice happened, and that's why it's on that side. And the Jewish quarter was in ruins because of the battles. When the Jordanians took it over, they essentially pushed over the rest of the buildings or the ruins that didn't look very safe, and they left it in ruins at that point. And they also forbade Jews from living in the West Bank. So there was no Jewish presence. So that means that the only active sacred space was the top of the Temple Mount, where the dome was, rather than, and the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, was not relevant at all. So, let's see, I just said all that. 1967 rolls around. There's the Six-Day War. There has been, in the late spring, a lot of saber rattling by the Arab nations. They're sort of issuing ultimatums, and Israel is coming back with them. And what winds up happening is that on June 5th, Israel decides to preempt this. It attacks Egypt, destroys its air force on the ground. Egypt actually had an air force of 250 warplanes that were all destroyed before they even got to take off. And that essentially made the war go very nicely for the Israelis. And within 6 days, essentially, everybody is suing first for a ceasefire, and then these become the armistice lines. During this time, Israel takes over the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It takes over the West Bank from Jordan, as well as East Jerusalem, and of course, the old city. It takes over the Golan Heights from Syria, and it takes over the Gaza Strip. It gave back, through a series of negotiations, the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but it still retains control, or at least security control, over all of the other spaces. And that means it has had to administer them since 1967. There have been a variety of peace negotiations that have taken place, particularly over the West Bank, partially over Gaza. They have changed things. They have not to come to any, shall we say, permanently successful conclusions. Trying to not run over my time here. this is how it changes in Jerusalem. Essentially, the Israelis take over all of Jerusalem. The blue part is where the Jews live, and the yellow part is where the Arabs live. And if you look carefully, like here, you can see that the Jews are building neighborhoods to begin to surround the Arab part. They are putting, let's just call them settlements, up in the Arab areas of Jerusalem. And if you look here at this blue part or at these dark parts over here, these are settlements that are actually in West Bank territory, Jewish settlements. And so what they're trying to do is surround the Arab part of Jerusalem. And they've been working at that slowly, but consistently since 1967. And Jerusalem is now a unified city under one government. It was not prior to this. You really get a sense when you visit of, shall we say, unequal treatment of the two sides. The Jerusalem, the West Jerusalem Jewish side is quite wealthy looking. It looks like any modern European or modern American city. There's not a single skyscraper over in East Jerusalem. It's all old stone. In fact, it looks a lot like UW campus. A lot of sandstone buildings. Just to sort of pull the pieces back together, there's of course political ramifications to this. How do you manage these kinds of sacred sites? The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa are managed by an organization called the Waqf, which is, in general terms, essentially a charitable organization. But in the specific situation of the Dome of the Rock, it is management of state property for the benefit of religious purposes. And the Waqf is an organization of 18, well, it has a board with 18 members. It is run by the Jordanians. In fact, until 5 or so years ago, only Jordanians could be members of the board. They were all appointed by Jordan. And in 2017, they began to appoint a few Palestinians also to the board to have local representation. That's the sort of physical management of the site, the security management within the Arab world, et cetera. The religious management is done by the chief mufti, a position which was created in 1918 by the British occupation, and that has continued since then, and the current mufti is appointed by Mahmoud Abbas, who is the current leader of the state of Palestine. Israel likes this arrangement. The only change that it puts onto it is that it is ultimately responsible for the security of that. Administration of the Western Wall is done by the Western Heritage Foundation, which is largely made up of ultra-Orthodox people. The wall has changed over the last few decades towards much more presentation and organization according to Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox principles. That means they're often in conflict with the majority of Israelis who are secular or not ultra-Orthodox, shall I say. And what we hear about most in the press, at least here, is about the women of the wall. Women who essentially want to act like modern religious women, participate in worship, on an equal footing as men and with equal responsibilities. And the ultra-Orthodox males are not having it. And even when directed by the court, they have not given in. So there's continual conflict over that. But it's also in charge of archaeological excavations in the area. There are now tunnels. The wall actually goes down another 50, 60 feet below the modern surface area. There are excavated tunnels that you can get right up to the western edge of the western wall and visit it. There's also an archaeological park on the south and mostly on the south side. You can see the huge amount of excavations, some very ancient sites. And then, of course, there's the people who can't keep it to themselves, and they want to establish what would now be called the third temple, a new temple on the dome, destroy the dome of the rock and put a temple there. There's a number of different kinds of groups, some with heavily religious orientation, others much more modern but with religious beliefs. And they do various things like rushing up and organizing prayer sessions on the dome, or learning how to do Passover sacrifices with the aim of restoring that on the Temple Mount, and so on. So I want to leave you with this final thought, is that sacred space winds up being a line in the sand or in the stone, in the rock here. Anytime you start talking about a religion talks about its sacred space, it winds up being something they can't compromise on. That they can't, the belief in their own righteousness becomes extremely difficult to manage, and it is only with secular authorities who can step in and try to balance the struggle, balance the power of the different groups to make that work better. Given that the current Israeli government is heavily religious, we're seeing the bending of that set of principles, and ultimately, if things don't change, I expect them to break, and there be some problems there. So with that, I need to conclude my talk and hand the mic to Kate.
By the way, you don't have to sit behind the table if you're more comfortable standing up, or people can see better and feel free. I personally stand up. I'm short, but
I have to hold multiple things here and turn my pages as well. Awesome. So hello everyone, it's great to see you here. My name is Kate Hartmann. I'm Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Wyoming. I specialize in the history of pilgrimage in Tibet, but I teach about the religions, history, and philosophy of Asia more generally. And so what I want to do today is just give you a crash course in the history of Tibet, an explanation of the current geopolitical situation, and, excuse me, sorry. And raise the question of what will happen when the current Dalai Lama passes away inevitably and the future of Tibet is under question. So all right, this is the 14th Dalai Lama, born in 1935. His name is Tenzin Gyatso, and he's born in a poor village in eastern Tibet. Perhaps you guys have recognized him. Has anyone ever been to a talk of his? Okay, some folks in the back. He's renowned as like a very good speaker. And he just celebrated his 89th birthday on July 6th, so happy birthday to His Holiness, HH the DL, we can call him. And these days he's well known for traveling the world, giving talks, talking about the importance of compassion and wisdom. But he's also a very controversial figure in China today. While he's widely admired around the world and even won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, the Chinese government has banned him from entering China, and Tibetan people in China are not even allowed to have a photo of the Dalai Lama. But who is he? Why is he important? Why is he such a point of contention? And what is going to happen when this 89-year-old man eventually does what must eventually happen to us all and leaves this mortal coil? So let's start with the question of what is Tibet? This is actually a very complicated question. This question of what is Tibet, who controls it, goes to the heart of lots of these issues. And it's extra complicated because Tibet and China have had border disputes that date back to the 8th century. And in the past, we didn't necessarily have these firm borders, these lines in the sand that Paul was talking about. So you often have intermixed communities and debates about the borders of these regions. But what we can say is that this area of Tibet, which you can see here in the multicolored regions, is a high mountainous region. I actually, when I came to Wyoming, my pitch was that Wyoming is a lot like Tibet. It's high, dry, it's windy, people wear cowboy hats, and pastoral agriculture is how you, and mineral wealth that gets mined. Feels very Wyoming. And these colored areas are where Tibetan-speaking peoples would have lived historically. However, only this yellow area is currently recognized as the Tibet Autonomous Region in the People's Republic of China. And so these areas on the border are highly disputed and are complicated. We can talk about that in the Q&A. So one important fact about Tibet is that it's largely Buddhist. Shortest crash course to Buddhism ever. Buddhism is founded about the 5th century BCE in northern India as the goal of eliminating life's sufferings by eliminating greed, hatred, and ignorance. And so through dedicated practices of eliminating bad actions, cultivating positive mental attitudes, and purifying the mind, you can hopefully eliminate suffering. Buddhism exists in India for about 1,200 years before it started spreading to Tibet in about the year 700. And when it gets to Tibet, it inevitably meets the ideas and practices that were already there, combines with them, and forms this distinctive form of Buddhism known as Tibetan Buddhism. Now, people assume a lot of things about Tibet. One is that it's really peaceful. This is not true. The history of Tibet is as bloody as any other people's history. One of the challenges when we're studying Tibet is that we often want to project this fantasy of this romantic, peaceful Shangri-La onto these people. And the first thing I do when I'm teaching my UW students is that people are human first, Buddhist second. And that can be for both good or ill. So the history of Tibet is a bloody one. We have emperors, then we have ruling, warring clans, and then eventually the Dalai Lamas come into power, but not until 1642, relatively late in the game, all things considered. So 1642, the Great Fifth Dalai Lama establishes control of Tibet. But I know all of you are wondering, what is a Dalai Lama? One of the distinctive things about Tibetan Buddhism, in contrast to lots of other forms of Buddhism, is that Buddhists generally maintain that after you die, you get reborn into some other form. If you were a good person and did good things, you might be reborn as like a wealthy person or a god or something like that. But if you did bad things, you might get reborn as a snake or a bug or something. And most of us, we don't have very much control over this process. We try to do good things, we try not to do bad things in the hopes of influencing a little bit. But according to Tibetan Buddhists, certain figures are so spiritually advanced that they can actually control this process. And the Dalai Lamas are an example of someone who is believed to be able to control this process and to take rebirth very intentionally and come back to help people. And there's actually about 1,000, possibly more, of these reincarnation lineages known as tulkus. Some just as small as a single village will have an honored tulku. Other religious sects will have their own tulkus. The Dalai Lama is the most famous, but he's not the only one. But the Dalai Lama is special insofar as he's supposed to be a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, known in Tibetan as Chenrezig, who we can see here, has the 1,000 arms so he can help people. And so the Dalai Lama for the Tibetan people represents this Bodhisattva on earth. What is, we can analogize to a god on earth. And in particular, this god, this Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, is the patron deity of the Tibetan people, a protector of the Tibetan people. And so the Dalai Lamas claim to be these protectors. Now, remember that bloody history of Tibet? A lot of other Tibetans would have fought to the death to disagree with this idea. But in the modern period, people kind of coalesce around the Dalai Lamas. And so when a tulku dies, their followers look for a baby born around a year after the person dies. And they perform various tests to try to figure out who the reincarnation is, if it's a legitimate person. And now, do folks recognize this movie scene? I can no longer show this in my classes because my students do not recognize it. Do any of you recognize this? Okay, my younger tech people know this, but I'm catering to my main audience here. So in this scene from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He is presented with a table full of cups, some of them gold, some of them wooden, some of them glass, bejeweled, and he has to choose which is the Holy Grail, which was the cup of Jesus. And he chooses the wooden one and he says, this is the cup of a carpenter. They basically do that to pick the next Dalai Lama. They take the old implements of the previous Dalai Lama, which are often, insofar as this is a monk who is meant to live a humble life, are wooden rather than gold. And so they go to this child, they perform various tests, but this is one of them. And if the child kind of reaches for the things that belong to his past master, that's how you know. There's various other tests, but this is the fun one. Okay. Your children will have watched this show. Okay. So there have been a total of 14 Dalai Lamas. The current Dalai Lama is the 14th. But the lineage starts with the third, and then they retroactively sort of name the first two, and then the fifth is the one that establishes military control over Tibet, and then it goes on to the present day. And interestingly enough, this fifth Dalai Lama, who you see pictured here, the Great Fifth, they call him in Tibet, was put up by a descendant of Genghis Khan, known as Khusri Khan. And so essentially the Tibetan theocracy was upheld by the military might of the Mongols, is a fun fact. So under the government of the Dalai Lamas, which is headquartered in this building known as the Potala Palace, which was for centuries the tallest building on Earth, it is a government that's known in Tibetan as Chisi Nidrel, which is to say secular affairs and religion combined into one. And so what we could say is that this is a religious theocracy supported by, the Dalai Lama is at the head of both religion and state, although those things wouldn't have been thought of as necessarily super different, supported by an aristocratic class of ministers. And they move the capital to Lhasa, which we could see on the map. So we've got our aristocratic rulers in a form of government known as the Kasha. And when I'm teaching about this to students, they say, we're here in Wyoming, we're the equality state, we don't like to be ruled over by anyone, much less an aristocratic group of ruling families. But for the average Tibetan person, who else would you want to be in control of you besides the Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion? And so the government held a lot of legitimacy for Tibetan people, such that it never needed to be very militarily strong, right? A state that doesn't have necessarily a lot of legitimacy culturally will need to have a strong army to maintain power. The Tibetan government didn't need that. However, that lack of an army becomes a problem when you have a very powerful neighbor. And so if we see Tibet over here in this high mountainous region and China as really based in the East Coast, Tibet and China since about the year 800 have had shifting borders. At one point, the Tibetan Empire is strong enough to conquer the Chinese capital at Chang'an. At other points, the Chinese dominate Tibet. But functionally, for most of Tibetan history, whether or not China was in control of Tibet, Tibet was far enough away and high enough in altitude that the Chinese government never exerted much control in everyday affairs of Tibetans. However, with the Chinese Civil War, which results in the victory of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, Mao exerts a vision of Chinese unifying all of the various peoples that they see as part of their empire. And this includes the 5 families, including notably the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. And so from this period in the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party has a vision of uniting all of Tibet under one rule. And the Tibetan government is frankly in no shape to fend off this incursion. They were traditionalists. This Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, when he saw this coming, He wanted to institute lots of reforms, educational reforms, build up the military, and conservative forces within the monastery said, well, we don't want you, the government, to have too much power. And these reforms were kind of squashed such that when the Chinese government does come into Tibet, Tibetans are just not ready for it. They also have this problem that if you're ruled by a lineage of reincarnations, when you find the new one, it takes a few years before they're kind of ready to make big decisions. And so when the 13th Dalai Lama passes away and they find the 14th Dalai Lama, and he's found at around the age of 4 or 5, so this is 1939, it takes a while before he's ready to make some big decisions, you know. Yes, how'd you like to be in that stage? Okay. So in 1949, Mazadong had been fighting in what is known as the Chinese Civil War, emerges as victorious and founds the People's Republic of China in 49. And they immediately start coming towards Tibet and other border regions to establish control. They easily defeat Tibetan forces in Chamdo in 1950, and by 1951, the Tibetans are forced into what's known as the 17-point agreement, where they give authority to the Chinese government. However, in this agreement, internal autonomy is guaranteed. But what that means, whether this treaty has legitimacy, who signed it, who had the power, all of these things are highly debated. So from this period of 51 to 59, here you see HH the DL, and then Mao, they're trying to make it work. And for a lot of Tibetans, when they hear communist promises of, we're gonna help the people, you know, we want everyone to have enough food, they're like, great, that actually sounds a lot like Buddhism. And so within Tibetan Buddhist monasteries at this time, there was actually a lot of support for the communist project. However, in this period of 51 to 59, tensions start to rise as the Chinese government is trying to impose reforms in Tibet. Tensions gradually rise, and eventually in 1959, the Dalai Lama flees to India and establishes the government in exile. This government in exile, headquarters in Dharamsala in the north of India, in the foothills of the Himalayas, still exists. This is Pempat Tsering, the current prime minister. And when they go into exile, the government starts to try to introduce democratic reforms. One of the things that the Chinese Communist Party had criticized about Tibet is that this is basically a theocracy in which your average everyday person had very little wealth, they were often tied to their land, they were forced to be agricultural workers, and, you know, maybe not everyone wants to be an agricultural worker their whole life. So the Tibetan government in exile introduces these democratic reforms and elections, and they've tried to maintain some sense of legitimacy for the 600,000 Tibetans that are now in exile. And for a while, the Dalai Lama is in charge of this. He's directing these reforms. But eventually in 2011, he officially retires from politics. He says, I'm only the religious leader now. For politics, we're going to separate, you know, religion and politics were together for a long time. Now we're going to separate them. I'm going to do the religion side. Please focus on your democratically elected leaders. The Tibetans keep looking to the Dalai Lama, however. He's quite beloved. And Tibetans in exile have various challenges, right? They are not officially Indian citizens. They don't have Indian citizenship cards, which can make it difficult for them to get education and jobs. India is also not a very wealthy country, so lots of people struggle with, you know, if this is a temporary situation, we can handle it, but as the situation of exile has lasted for much longer, how are we going to make a living and hold this community together? Meanwhile, in Tibet itself, the party has instituted a program of assimilating the Tibetan people into Han majority customs. So I won't go through the whole period of the Cultural Revolution and various protests, but the government wants Tibet, which they see as a potential flashpoint for trying to get independence, they want to bring the Tibetans back into control. And part of how they do that is by really restricting religious culture, progressively banning Tibetan language education such that today most Tibetan youth don't speak Tibetan, they speak Chinese, and trying to send Han migrant workers to live in Tibet itself. So the question then is, what happens next, right? The Dalai Lama is 89 years old. He has said that he had a dream that he would live to 111, but who can say? And so a lot of people have this question. With Tibetans in exile, the fact that the Dalai Lama has been this globally very popular leader has held the community together. And so what will happen next, right? Especially, let's say, do you find a child, right? Then there's 18 years and there's a good chance that child might not want to be a Dalai Lama, right? So this is something that the Tibetan government in exile, and indeed the US government, has been highly involved in trying to figure out what's going to happen next. In 2022, this white paper was published by essentially the Tibet Initiative, the Tibetan government in exile, with a lot of US government. And the official line is that they're going to reject Chinese control over this selection process. The thing that everyone fears is that within China there will be a child identified by the Communist Party as the official representative. This has happened before, where you'll have dueling candidates. And then if there's one picked in exile, then you have a crisis of legitimacy. So the Dalai Lama has said that only the Tibetan people, the Tibetan government in exile, will have authority over picking this reincarnation lineage. However, he's also opened up the possibility that perhaps the institution of the Dalai Lamas is no longer necessary in the 21st century. Perhaps it won't take rebirth. Perhaps he could pick an adult as an emanation rather than an incarnation. People ask if the next Dalai Lama could be a woman, and he's officially said, thumbs up to that, we'll see how it goes. But he said that he will not be reborn in occupied Tibet, but in some area of northern India or Mongolia where a candidate can be identified. So I'm sure you have lots of questions about that, but we'll save them for the Q&A. Thank you.
Now, Jean.
Okay, so these two are hard to act to follow. So maybe I'll talk about some things that are a little bit more familiar, but I think the themes that pull us together are the importance of history and how history manifests today. And I'm a political scientist and a specialist in international relations, so I really operate at the 30,000-foot level in some ways. And so I'll just admit up front that you're getting, I'm telling a story here. And the story that I want to tell, and this is a story I was telling in actually some classes that I designed in the London semester for UW students this spring. So I had great luck to lead UW's London semester. So I was over there for 3.5 months across the whole spring. And I taught 2 classes. One was Britain and the World, which of course had some ties to some of my specialization in. And then another one was on power, performance, and popular culture. Now that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but where those two came together was that London was the classroom. And so that experiential learning experience for students, getting them out, going to certainly museums and performances, a lot of high culture, made sure we had some low culture in there as well, but that study abroad experience, which takes our students and puts them in a place long enough to maybe feel what is it like to live somewhere else. London is the most popular study abroad location for American students. And we have had this exchange for 40 years. So it's one of our oldest, certainly at the university. So I was coming at it from the perspective of someone who, I don't particularly study Britain, but when I was putting these classes together, I was very much struck by how you can use a venue, another location like London, to have people talk about some of the same ideas that emanate in what's going on today. in the United States. The other thing, though, that really unites the United States and Britain is what the British themselves would talk about as the special relationship, which is that notion of shared meaning, shared background, part of which is the liberal order, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a moment. But that shared sense of history, that shared sense of identity, that certainly many Americans share and the British in many cases share. Now there are exceptions, so I'm already operating right at that 30,000 foot level. But I'm going to be talking about some of those similarities, some of those things that unite us. And what's interesting, though, although there are certainly major political differences, of course, between the British and the Americans, there are similar trends. There's polarization going on in Britain. There is a rural-urban divide. The real economic powerhouse in the UK is London. So when you talk about things going on, a lot of times, financial center still, et cetera, kind of cultural center, it's London, and people outside of London feel very divorced from that. London is highly multicultural. Actually, I really see the UK quite multicultural. And that was one of the things that I've learned, So living there myself for that period of time was a major learning experience for me as well. So as I walked in seeing some similarities, I also saw where the divergences were, it's very interesting. So I guess what I'm telling you is, in a sense, you're getting my intellectual journey on how I put these courses together. So I want you to, though, you got to imagine this because I don't have a heck of a lot of pretty pictures for you, but I want you to think about a map of the world. And I want you to think about how significant it was that from particularly in the midpoint of Victoria's rule. So Victoria ruled Britain from, that's what I was looking up a minute ago, 1837, I believe, to 1901. So you have almost 200 years of this development of this liberal order. Again, I'm going to be defining this. This doesn't mean liberal in our political sense. It's economic liberalism. It's individual freedom. Now, a lot of that came at the point of a gun or a sword, certainly, because the spreading of these ideas that I'm going to be talking about came with gunboat diplomacy in many cases. And so empires then, even if you're spreading a liberal empire, come with a lot of violence. And so, but think about this as kind of being an order that at one point, the little island of Britain, why Britain? That's a very fascinating question to really ponder. How could Britain, or how could the UK really, through colonialism, et cetera, how could it go from being an island that if you had good roads, it really wouldn't take more than 6 hours to go north to south. I mean, it takes a little bit longer because they're windy and narrow, but it's really small. It's the size of Idaho. How did that happen? Well, I can tell you that fear of neighbors, by the way, is a motivator. But, kind of that economic powerhouse that became Britain really did spread that. So at one point, at its height, the British Empire stretched across about 20% of the world's people and about 25% of the geography. So just think about that. Think about that in the context of kind of where the U.S. has had some dominance, and economic dominance, if not physical dominance. So I just want you to picture that. So when I was putting this course together, and I had 10 students go with me, then it was really important to provide a context for students who, in most cases, know very little about American history, unfortunately, and forms of government, but also probably know basically zero about Britain. And so we had to spend some time. I got to pick some books that in order to provide some of that historical background. How do you do the British Empire in 3 weeks? Well, you never fared to it. But I wanted people to have some context. And so, and that was the inspiration for the London semester. Let me spend a minute defining this liberal empire. What does it mean to be part of, the UK and the United States? following a liberal script. Now, this comes from some of the research I do with Thomas Rissa and Tanya Bertzel. We have a book coming out with Oxford University Press. And we talk about the liberal script as a shared understanding of how we organize our societies. And this is based on things that will be very familiar to you, I believe. Individual rights, and the expansion of those over time, individual freedom, which have both individual expression and collective self-determination. And we talk about in our work 3 spheres. The political sphere, where it's the rule of law. In the United States, it's the separation of powers, the universality of democracy and human rights. In the economic sphere, it's talking about market allocation of resources, the importance of the value of private property. And in the social sphere, it's about pluralism, tolerance, openness to lifestyles. Now, there are tensions between individual and collective versions of these, and that manifests in our politics today. So we can talk about that if you'd like. I would also say that we could probably jump and have that discussion in August, because I bet when Tanya and Thomas are part of the August presentation, they'll probably be talking about this. But there's also this shared sense of meaning behind these things across the UK in general and across the United States. There's also a shared sense of mission. So there's a script, and there's a script that I would say has dominated the geopolitics of the globe since certainly midpoint of Victoria's reign. So 150 years or so, I think it's certainly coming into, it's breaking down a little bit. But 80 years of that, post-World War II, is the US leading that. So the US is the successor to the British experiment, so to speak, around the world. But there's this shared sense of mission. There's a shared sense of exceptionalism as well. Kind of God-given kind of responsibility, chosen. There's a chosenness to this. And that's the sort of thing that it's really fun to have students reading books about and dealing with some of these ideas. So I'm setting this up so you can see a little bit about, I'm going to talk about actually 5 books I'm recommending to you if you haven't read them. And this is what I had our students do. So I guess you're walking through in 5 minutes what I did across the course of the semester. So we're bringing these ideas of balance of power, geopolitics, but also the shared sense of identity that we have between the British and the Americans. And in order to understand British imperialism, which manifests, by the way, in so many museum exhibits, certainly. You go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I absolutely recommend if you haven't gone there. But that sense of kind of the technology of the time, the modernity that you see with it. This book here, Empire, by Niall Ferguson, is the short title is Empire, but How Britain Made the Modern World. Now, this was actually published in 2003. It's very dated. It predates all the controversies about whether the empire is a good thing or not. I had a student come to me, one of my best students come to me, in about three weeks into the course, said, "Why are you having us read this book? My British history professor is appalled that you are reading this book. Why would I have you read this book?" Because I thought, let's establish the ideas and the common beliefs that people held about the exceptionalism of the British Empire. Even though this is nuanced, this is a discussion that's very nuanced, but it's dated. And I paired this book with Sathnam Sengira's book Empireland, which is published in 2023. He's got and this is a book where he talks about what is the impact of empire, of Britain going out and colonizing the world. What is the impact of that on British society? And he looks at it, he says, well, it led to a very multicultural society. It also led to a people in the UK not understanding very much about their own history. And there's a lot of controversy about multiculturalism. There's a lot of culture wars going on today. And as soon as we switched over to the Empireland book, I think she had an aha moment of, oh, now I know Why? Because you're talking, when you can't read Empire Land if you don't know anything about the British Empire. And our students knew nothing about the British Empire, but it's also not taught in the UK education system. So anyway, I recommend that book too. He's written a new one in 2024 looking at the impact of Britain on the world. This is his book here, Empire Land, is looking at the context of what's going on. So the themes that we were bringing out then were not only understanding British imperialism, and by the way, he's not one of those people who says, let's have a balance sheet about the US, or excuse me, about Britain being good, or Empire being good or bad. It's about understanding history and understanding the gray area, the nuance. And he's writing this book at the same time that they're pulling down statues of Churchill and other things going on. The controversies in the British Museum about the Benin bronzes and other things going back to places where they were literally taken at the point of a gun or point of a sword. So these are a lot of controversies that are roiling in Britain, and also during an election cycle as well. So as we know, the Labour Party has just come back into power as of July 4th. I think that was much more of a vote against the Tories more than it was really a vote for it's a vote against the Tories more than a vote for Labour. But really, the politics of some of the same kind of issues about immigration that are going on in our country today, these were things that were, part and parcel of the media that I was watching. But understanding whether it's empire or criticism of empire, it's important to understand that the mythology of our history and our sense of understanding that a story that is believed by a group, which is then in turn used to define meaning and purpose and collective identity. And this is something that the British have. I shouldn't even be using the term British, probably I should be saying UK. And I think Americans hold this as well. So there's a plot in these books, just like there's a plot in the stories that we're telling in these short presentations. But these are meaningful narratives, and they're culturally significant, and they resonate. These are some of the lessons from Ferguson's Empire. And his claim that if you look at the Victorians, that this is the very cradle, that Britain was really the cradle of modernity. And these are themes that I was interested in looking at and talking about in the class, not just because of an election cycle, but because Britain is now in its post-Brexit cycle. If you think of it, and you think about, so Brexit, voting to move out of Europe, voting, many people say it was against the economic self-interest of Britain to do this. Why would you get a majority of people voting, not the Londoners, by the way, not the younger people voting for Brexit, people in Cornwall, people out and about. Scotland certainly didn't vote for Brexit. So actually one of the consequences of the Brexit vote in Britain has been greater economic hardships and actually greater possibility of separation. Certainly Scottish nationalism will be motivated by that. Farmers in Cornwall, when they voted to exit Europe, in many ways were voting for that Greater Britain again, and that notion that the island was special, that it had a broader global role, not as one country in a union, but as something special and independent. So some of these themes about exceptionalism then come out in the context of the Brexit vote as well. And there are various island stories about specialness. Well, there are various stories about specialness in the United States. And so when I had them read this book, it set up an opportunity to do some comparison between what's gone on in Britain historically, because the British Empire, after all, the arc of the British Empire is really up through the Second World War, and then the United States stepping in and taking over, kind of taking on the mantle of that role globally. So what can we learn? I'm not going to have time to talk about it, in this presentation. But what can we learn about from the arc of the British Empire in thinking about the arc of the American Empire? So here are 3 great reads. Now, keep in mind, when I say it's a great read, it might put you to sleep. But in my field of study, there's a debate about America's specialness of the United States, American exceptionalism. Back to the notion of the city on the hill. Is the United States a city on the hill? Is it, is there, kind of crusading mission to go out and take the good things, institutions that we have here, let's share it with the world. So there's a role of expanding that out into the world. There's also that view that, well, maybe we're just the example. Maybe we should just be an example to the world. But this is the notion of innocence and benevolence. Now, this is very simplistic, of course. But, it still comes out in polling data today in terms of people seeing, in general, a belief of America's special purpose in the world. Now, where does that break down? It breaks down a little bit when you do look at demographics. Younger people are a little bit more cynical about that than older people. And now, in the context of polarization of politics, it is held very firmly, particularly from the center to the right of politics, and less so on the left. And this also comes out in the context of how do we teach civics, how do you talk about the role of the United States in the world. So the Seymour Martin Lipset is the classic. He's no longer with us, but he's written the classic books. The most modern here is the Tyrrell book. This is a 2024 book. All talking about American exceptionalism, kind of looking historically, the notion of landing, on the continent and being able to be special and setting up the institutions here, kind of creating that something new away from the evils of the bounds of politics, bounds of power of the European empires. This is the book I was telling you about that I'm a part of with also my colleague Stephanie Anderson at the University of Wyoming. This book. It will be available August 6th. It is made by public access. I know this is a plug, but I'm not asking for any money. You can download it free as a PDF. And we did that specifically. We actually paid the publisher to make it publicly available. And this is a map that we have in the book, just looking at the November 2022 electoral results. It's kind of hard because it's not in color, but if you look at this and you think about the darker colors, Alaska's a little bit of an odd thing. Darker being the congressional races for Democrats, the lighter ones being Republicans. Look at that urban-rural divide that we have in terms of who gets elected to Congress in the United States. So I think we're grappling with an uncertain future today, and I think this electoral cycle is fascinating. Actually, some of the press coming around now talking about what is the impact of having former President Trump, somebody trying to kill former President Trump. So there's discussions, think about the politics today, maybe this lens about how we think about our shared meaning and where are we divided? Why are we as divided as we are today? Are we in a crisis of democracy? I think, Paul, you talked about in the context in your presentation of kind of there's little room for compromise. There is very little room for compromise when you've decided that it's an us versus them dialogue, and that's what we do see in the polarization of American politics today. We saw some of that in Britain. We also have gridlock and undermining of American institutions. I'm going to take my 30 seconds. I think there's some parallels to see from the context of the July 4th elections in the UK and what's coming up in November. And I just want to leave you with kind of a sense of where we are as citizens. After all, we live in a polity where we are responsible, right, for not only our own actions, but our governments. And there are a number of initiatives out there that talk about how do you manage conflict resolution when you have so much polarization going on. Well, there are a lot of civic engagement approaches. One is, these are some that I'm involved in, or read about and write about, The Disagree Better initiative is something that Governor Gordon is involved in. This is the National Governors Association. This is the notion that healthy conflict for better policy. So I'm a big advocate that don't avoid conflict, assume you're going to have it. How do you manage it? How do you have healthy conflict rather than destructive conflict? What about groups that are about bridge building? Well, the Better Angels, you might have heard of them. They actually stage encounters and debates to reduce political polarization. And then a group that has been involved up in Sheridan and also in the Cody school districts, the Essential Partners approach, and that's building relationships across differences to address their community's most pressing needs. So that's it. So as a political scientist, where I come at it is that we're a problem-solving nation. And so this is advocating for problem-solving approaches. And then I was going to leave you with one picture. It's actually three. There you are. I lived near, I was on Notting Hill. So this is one of my first pictures there. Actually, one of the 5 times I saw the sun. Here we are with our group of Wyoming students. Of course, one of our first excursions going to Big Bend. We also sat in on a parliament session. And then it was very interesting because the other nice thing about London as a cosmopolitan city is that when Alexei Navalny died, you know, there were flowers and kind of things set up all over at a lot of protests. So students had an opportunity to engage both culturally and politically if they so chose. And I'm out of time. Thank you.
So we're confident we have questions, right?
Who needs him?
Who would like to get us started?
Is Tibet more than half Han Chinese now?
The population of Lhasa is, so similarly you have a few central cities that are the centers of most economic development and lots of rural areas. So Lhasa is, Tibet generally is not as of now, although it's very difficult to get clear numbers on any of these sorts of things. But yes, it's a flashpoint for Tibetan protests that they feel as though they are becoming a minority in their own homeland.
That's a brilliant strategy on the part of the Chinese government. They moved people and incentivized people who were rolling out of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to go settle. And the reason, when they were talking about in 1989, when they talked, before Tiananmen Square, when they were talking about having local elections, what you want to do is moving Han Chinese in by thousands and thousands would be such that if you ever had elections, they would dominate. So I thought it was a brilliant strategy on the part of takeover strategy on the part of the Chinese government.
And also the building of roads, and there's a high-speed rail to Lhasa, and active programs of offering money for settlers.
While you're all cooking, I'm going to ask Paul. You talked about the temple platform and the dome and the mosque and the wall. About 500 yards away, there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Can you tell us about it and the contention surrounding it? Because it's more than just that one spot, right?
Yes. I left the Christians out on purpose to try and keep things as short as I managed to keep them. The Christians have a very different strategy. Christianity, of course, Jesus is alive during Herod's time, or his immediate successor. That temple that Herod built is the one that Jesus would have visited. And then what happens after Jews are banned from Judea, the people who are around initially are Roman. They are secular, not secular, but pagan. Let's just use that term. And in fact, within a couple hundred years, they have forgotten the name Jerusalem refers to that space. There's an interesting transcription, a story about somebody, a Christian who goes up to trial before a Roman judge, and he says, the Christian says, I'm not from the from this worldly Jerusalem, I'm from the heavenly Jerusalem. And the judge sort of looks at him and says, what are you talking about? What worldly Jerusalem? Because to him, it's Aelia Capitolina. That's the name of the spot. But after Constantine becomes emperor of the entire Mediterranean wide Roman Empire in 324, his mother has become a Christian. And so his mother goes on a trip to the Holy Land, which is her turn, and she starts looking for the spaces, and she finds what becomes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Jesus was not only crucified but resurrected, came back to life. She finds it in a spot about 500 yards away from the Temple Mount. And ultimately, Christianity, after Constantine revives, it becomes the Christian Roman Empire. And they go back and find all these holy spots in Jerusalem and around the country where God did things, Jesus did things, exercised his power, but they leave the Temple Mount undeveloped. They leave it in ruins because to them it's the symbol that Christianity has superseded Judaism. They are now, if you want to worship the God, it is Christianity that you have to go to, not Judaism anymore. And that's why when Islam came by 3 centuries later, they've got a clear space to build the Dome of the Rock because nothing's built there.
That makes it very interesting about the Ten Commandments, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Yes.
The Christians say, well, those are our commandments, but not really.
Well, the entire Christian Bible, that if you own a Bible, put all the Old Testament in your left hand and all of the New Testament in your right hand, what you realize is the Old Testament, which is essentially equivalent to the Jewish Bible, is about 3 times the size, maybe 4 times the size of the New Testament. And what the New Testament really is it tells stories, but those stories reinterpret the religious values and beliefs that you find in the Old Testament. It's a new religion, but it's based on that old religion.
Additional questions?
I have maybe a convoluted question, and Kate, it sort of came up with your presentation on the Dalai Lama and Tibet, but anybody could answer this, because it feels like we're dealing with sort of this tension of how we even define space and how we approach it. So particularly with the Dalai Lama having to say, we're going to change up how we think about where the new Dalai Lama is going to come from, and sort of having to take part of what makes Tibet sacred, and sort of change that. So it feels like there has to be a flexibility in how we think of space and what makes space sacred and how we make space sacred. So thoughts on that?
There's a whole field of space and place studies. There's whole units in anthropology and religious studies that talk about these issues, right? Because what is it that when you encounter a place, you walk into, if I was to walk into the Temple Mount, I would feel some sort of something, regardless of whether or not I believe in any of those religions. There's meaning already there. But also, what I believe about a place affects how I see it. So an interesting thing in Tibet is you have mountains like Mount Kailash that are sacred for multiple religions, but where you don't necessarily have contestation. It's just that different people go, and they kind of see the stories that they want to see. And so the scholarship on space and place is always a debate between, do places have meaning in them inherently when people go, or do people project meaning onto space? And the answer is always, it's a little bit of both all the time. But yeah, the meaning of space, we're never walking into a tabula rasa, a blank space. We're always walking into something where there's meaning inherent in it. And yet, We as humans can change those meanings if we as a collective decide to. And so that's very much at issue with all these places. It's who gets to decide, how is that happening, and are those changes accepted by other people? Good.
So I'm going to take a moderator's privilege, and I'm going to tell you a case that I think all of you can work with, which is, some of you remember that I'm a literature person, but I work on 19th century heritage and increasingly 19th century tourism, and some of it is in the Middle East. And in the 19th century, both the Americans and the British are heading into what's then the Ottoman Empire, right, around that region of Palestine, Syria, etc. And they are looking to find their own direct connection again, post-Crusade, with that region. And the literature is fascinating. Some of it is the American surveyor for the Navy who's trying to figure out the depths of the Dead Sea. Right? So some of it's very precise like that. A great deal of it is looking at Christian traditions in the landscape and saying, this is all an incrustation of various forms of Catholicism. They're coming from Britain. So Britain, Catholics still do not have full rights in Britain. And so they're bringing a very Protestant eye to it. But guess what? There had been no real Protestantism in the Middle East. So General Gordon, who's a very big figure in British 19th century imperialism, is there as a visitor, and he's sitting in his little room up in the old city, and he looks out, and Britain there are no Protestant sites, there are no British sites, and he looks out and he says, oh, look, that thing, that is now the Blessed Mission, by the way, and Palestinian side, that thing looks like it's got two eyes in it. That must be the skull. So this must be Golgotha, and it's outside the wall, the new wall. And then he projects down the city, well, this, actually, if there's a skull, there must be a body. And he actually maps the spine along the streets of the old city of Jerusalem and lays out a whole skeleton and a whole system of belief that, so if you go to Jerusalem now, and people love what's called the Garden Tomb, that is General Gordon's identified site, the Garden Tomb. So a constructed reality, right? And so it's empire, very British, and there's a lot of British literature that about empire that suggests, well, if you go to the Banksy exhibit in on the West Bank, it'll say, it seems the British were to blame. I'm British, so. And it's also a site that contests with many other religious sites in Jerusalem, and there's not much presence of Buddhism in Israel and Palestine, possibly because they're overfull already. So I'd like you to talk about those oddities.
One of the weird things about visiting the Holy Land and that area of the Middle East is there is almost no Protestant presence. When I started going back in the 70s, I immediately discovered that I had to, even though I was an expert in Judaism, in terms of all the Christian sites I was visiting, I really had to raise my knowledge of Christianity, and particularly the non-Protestant groups. I knew something about Catholicism because it's fairly present here, but Greek Orthodox I'd at least heard of, but Ethiopian Orthodox? Come on. But they control part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So if you're going to understand that religious site, you need to figure these things out. And at least I did as a religious studies scholar. So suddenly you're on this whole education thing. And even today, there is very little Protestant thing. Garden Tomb may be one of the few places. What the Protestants have started doing is creating living museums, living history museums. So there is a place now called Nazareth Village. So if you go visit Nazareth, where the church is, you look at a church and it sort of looks like a fancy cathedral kind of a church. But if you go to the living history place, well, they've got a street and they have Arab actors, doing crafts and making things, baskets and pottery and so on, the way they would have done, and cooking over fires, and there's a synagogue there, and there's reconstructed houses, and they're more or less archaeologically correct, and it is much more interesting than visiting a church where it's sort of static. But what you wind up discovering, if you're Protestant, is that the only places where you have almost any resonance at all are the Catholic sites, and they're all in Galilee. That they control Cana, they control Capernaum, which is where Jesus set up his headquarters when he was preaching, and other places like where he gave the Sermon on the Mount and so on. Those are Catholic sites, and they're vaguely Western, at least European, if not American, and you can relate to them. So you really have this problem of the image that is presented to you. One of the things that I realized when I started doing archaeology and spending a good deal of time in Galilee is that Galilee looks like Wyoming, at least the parts of it that I was moving around in. Lots of hillsides with barren dirt, like the side of a ravine, and a lot of not very pleasant, brush and, weeds and this kind of stuff. In fact, the thistles there are about 3 times the size of Wyoming thistles. But I suddenly realized that when I saw pictures of the Holy Land, the pictures were of the site in front of me. But if I would just turn around, standing in the middle of the site and look around, Jesus, when he raised his eyes to the hills, he was looking at places that looked surprisingly like Wyoming, at least most of the year, just like July and August around here. It was brown and things were dead and there's a lot of dirt.
That's why we call it God's country.
I thought you were going to say there was an opening for a theme park.
There's a lot of Wyomings out in the world. There are Wyomings everywhere, with those to be honest to say. So with regard to Caroline's question about constructed places, and this goes to Greg's question as well, I'm going to tell you guys a Tibetan folktale. Because in Tibet, there are various debates about certain holy places. Is this the right place, or is it a case of General Gordon was like, well, we'll make it here, and then people just followed, and you have sort of this reconstructed space that doesn't have a legitimate history. That happens in Tibet as well. And if you push Tibetans on that, they'll tell you the story of the dog's tooth. So this folktale goes that there's a very devout mother who has this son who says he's going to go on pilgrimage to India. And she says, please bring me back a relic of the Buddha so that I can worship it. And this is, a good souvenir to bring back, some relic of the Holy Land. But unfortunately, her son is kind of a degenerate gambler, and he just goes and parties the whole time. And he spends his, 6 months in India. He comes back, and just as he's on the border of his village, he goes, "Oh shoot, I forgot what my mom said. I didn't bring her back anything." And just at the side of the road, there's a dead dog that is unfortunately been decaying out in the sun for a while. And so he grabs a tooth from this dog's mouth, this disgusting, rotting corpse, and kind of polishes it off and gives it to his mother and says, "I brought you a tooth of the Buddha, a relic of the Buddha himself." And the mother looks at this dog's tooth, and her reverence for it is so strong that it actually becomes a relic of the Buddha. That what matters is not necessarily the thing itself, but the stories that we believe about it, our attitude towards it. And so the mother sort of flies off to heaven, and the son is left to think about what he's going to do now. But yes, the notion of all of these constructed spaces and what they mean to us reminds me a lot of what Jane is surely going to talk about in terms of constructed places in American history and the stories we tell about them, our national identity being connected to certain kinds of places.
I can't beat that story, but I can't think of a more constructed sacred space than the British Museum, which is the wealth of many other places brought to London. And the theft in many cases, in some cases, the buying of artifacts from, one group maybe in the context of, selling it because they're basically selling their neighbor's stuff. In some cases, really, literally, the army coming in and learning that British Museum, what's the term? Acquisitioners, whatever that's not.
Acquires.
They were
Sessions.
They were British Museum officials were on these campaigns across Africa. They were there to take the Benin bronzes. They were there buying from the Ottomans. Things. I think about being involved, buying from maybe in cases those people who were in another empire, selling something locally. And yet then, and I think about the context of that. Well, there's some places where some of these things have been very much destroyed because of war. Maybe they were preserved because they were sitting in a museum in Berlin or sitting in a museum in London. So these are fascinating controversies, and they are alive and well. So you can go, go and see these things, and then the British Museum, which, by the way, by law, the things in the British Museum will never be repatriated. They might be loaned back in some cases. So there was a parliamentary act that said they will not be sent back, specifically from the British Museum. There are other museums around the world that have repatriated materials. And then but this is a place where the public can come and see them. Of course, then, I don't even think 1% of what the British Museum has is actually on exhibit. So there's you can just look at museums and really see the cosmos of a lot of very interesting issues. Very complicated issues. And then I'll just leave you with one thing, and that is that the world that we have today and the borders that we have today were constructed in many cases in small rooms in Paris or in London. So whether it's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is essentially the agreement between Britain and France defining spheres of influence in 1916, or whether it's the Balfour Declaration of 1917 saying, kind of guaranteeing or saying that we will support a Jewish homeland in Palestine, these are vestiges of agreements made between the great powers. And I think that period of the teens, the 19-teens, is fascinating to look at because there are a lot of parallels to kind of the world we are today as the liberal order declines and we're left with balance of power again, geopolitics, terms you used. I love seeing you use those terms, Kate. And they're back with us. Very in uncertain times.
Please join me in thanking our audience.